Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 28, Dublin's Literary Pubs. In October, I went to a travel vlogging conference in Ireland, and afterwards I stayed on a few days as a guest of Fáilte Ireland, which is the National Tourism Development Authority of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Working with tourism boards, I get to do a lot of really cool things that I wouldn't always know to do for myself. A lot of times when I travel, the way that I find out what I want to do is I go online and research what the historic places are. But sometimes there's a really cool activity that ties in history in a new and interesting way that I wouldn't always know to go do. And one of the things I love about my job is that a lot of times countries and cities will tell me what these things are so that I make sure to see them. And the trip that I was on was focused around the drama of Dublin, so it combined the literary history of Dublin with some of the other history and culture aspects to create like a really great 4-day itinerary that was just packed with all of these really cool things to do. And it'd be really easy for an itinerary that packed to feel too busy. But Dublin is just a really cool city, and there's so many really cool things to do that when you're there, you really don't want to just waste your time. We saw the Book of Kells at Trinity College. We went to a performance of Ulysses at the National Theatre. And I got to go to Marsh's Library, which is basically a time capsule for literature lovers. It's a 300-year-old library. It's amazing. But one of the highlights of the trip for me was Dublin's Literary Pub Crawl, which is not something I had heard about before I got there. It matched my love of Guinness with my love of Ireland's great writers. Going in, I knew I loved pints and I knew I loved poetry, but I didn't know anything about the history of Dublin's pubs and how they played an integral part in the city's literary legacy. My guest today is Colm Quilligan. He is the owner of the Dublin Literary Pub Crawl. We talk about how Dublin got its pubs, the important role they served in Irish literature and politics, and how the city and drinks have changed in the past 100 years or so. My guest today is Colm Quilligan. He is the owner of the Dublin Literary Pub Crawl, which I was lucky enough to get to go on when I was hosted by Fáilte Ireland in Dublin in October. And I had such an amazing time that I want you to tell everybody who listens to the show about the amazing history of the pubs in Dublin, because I truly had no idea before I went on your pub crawl how important they are to the city. So I'm so excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
So you don't just run this pub crawl, you have also written a book about the history of Dublin's pubs. And I purchased the book on your tour, which I'm really excited about. But do you want to tell everybody a little bit about the book?
Well, the book was in response to so many people asking me questions about whether we had a script of the tour or we had background information about the tour. And I decided then in 2008 to write down everything I knew about what I'd been doing for practically 25 years. So that took about 18 months to research and write and edit back and forth to the editor or editors, because there was a couple of different people, 3 or 4 people who read the book and gave me back feedback about what was in it and what was not in it, what should be in it, and so on. So that's how the book started back in 2008, which is 10 years ago now, incredibly. But so we sell the book at the end of the tour and during the tour if people are interested in getting more background information to what we're talking about. But essentially we're talking about the pub, the poet and the pint. And it's all about, the background that the pubs have for the writers and the motivation for people to get published and how they did it, how technically writers got published in Ireland when it was kind of difficult for Irish writers to get published. So many of them got out of the country and got to other parts of the world, particularly London and Paris. And Ireland was a kind of a fairly narrow, backward, anti-ideas place right during part of the 20th century. So that was one of the reasons why the pubs were very important to the writers.
I don't know how naive I was before I got there. Like, I don't know how widespread the information that I got from your tour is outside of the country in terms of how important these pubs were as a breeding ground for ideas and for connections. And it's almost the way that in America we get taught about, like, Hemingway meeting people in pubs, or not in pubs, but in cafes and bars in France. It's that kind of vitality and spreading of information. But let's back up even further and talk a little bit about the pubs in Dublin. How old are some of these pubs, and how did the pub rise as an important spot for all Irish people?
Well, I suppose it goes right back to the Middle Ages, when Dublin was a very small little village in and around High Street and Christchurch Cathedral, when there were bars and taverns and brothels probably in and around next door to each other, close to what was then the city centre, the hardcore of medieval Viking Dublin. But when water was not available cleanly, women brewed at home. And if a woman got a good reputation as a brewer, she opened her house to the public, and inadvertently started the whole idea of the public house. So the public house was a private house, but it became public because of the quality of what she was producing, and then she came around to the idea of selling it. So by the middle of the 17th century, pubs were all over the place, but they were unlicensed and unorganized. They were, it was a wild, ungoverned trade as such, and the authorities stepped in and decided to do two things. They created a license to run an orderly house, and secondly, they taxed alcohol for the first time. So that put the reins on the pub as an institution, but it also had itself firmly established in the minds and the locale of Dublin people, Irish people. So the pub was very much in the heart of the community. So you went there during the day. In the evening, sometimes you went there to get a job. If you were close to Docklands or the fruit markets, you would get paid there at the end of the day by the so-called gaffer who hired you for the day. So a significant portion of your money was spent behind the bar at the end of the day. So that's why the authorities felt that the connection between poverty and pubs was very strong, because working class people in these areas of Dublin didn't have a huge amount of money, but they left a fair bit of it in the pub behind them, because that's often where they got paid and where they got their job for the day.
Now, did Ireland ever have a prohibition like we did in the United States?
Prohibition. Well, we had various temperance movements. A famous man called Father Matthew drove a whole temperance movement in Ireland in the 19th century to try and wean us off the evils of alcohol. And you'll see statues of him in various cities, including O'Connell Street in Dublin, which is the premier street, and also there's Father Matthew stands on Patrick Street in Cork City, and there's even a Father Matthew Temperance Hall in Cork City, which is now a theatre, or which was a theatre for a long time. So yeah, our temperance movements could be akin to your prohibition movement, but I don't think there was any legal sort of law that stopped people buying and selling alcohol in the same way that they did in between 1920 and 1933 in America.
What are the oldest pubs in Dublin that are still around?
Well, it's supposed to be the case that the oldest pub in Dublin is the Brazen Head, and that's right beside the Bridge Street, which was one of the earliest crossing points in the Viking city. And tradition had it that just very close to where the city wall was, the gates were closed at night time, at a certain time of night, to stop the Irish from coming into this Anglo-Norman city, which Dublin was from 1210 onwards. So I suppose hostelries and small hotels are places for people to come and stay overnight if they didn't get into the city at night time. So they had to stay overnight outside in an inn or in a hostelry. And that's why a number of pubs or hostelries sprung up just outside the gates of Dublin to house all these people who would then be able to come in to the city to do their business or their trade the following morning. So it's said traditionally that the oldest pub in Dublin is the Brazen Head, because it still stands more or less in the spot outside where one of the original gates to the city wall was.
Oh, amazing. And what are some of the first pubs that interested you when you were creating your tour?
Well, we focused really on the literary pubs, the writers' pubs, because in 1929 the Irish government set up a censorship act to stop the Californication of Ireland. So pubs then came suddenly into play for journalists and writers and new writers, because they were often very close to a national newspaper. And there were three in Dublin. There was the Irish Independent, the Irish Press, which is now gone, and the Irish Times. And they were all within a quarter of a mile radius of each other. And hey presto, there was a pub almost next door to where all these journalists adjourned to at night time. And as a result of that, young writers came into those pubs to curry favour with editors and literary editors of those newspapers. So there were about six altogether: the Bailey and Davy Burns on Duke Street. You had MacDade's around on Harry Street. You had the Bachelor Inn, I think. You also had Mulligan's on Poolbeg Street, and famously the Palace bar on Fleet Street, which is still in existence. All those pubs are still rocking, still up and running. And they're very traditional in their style. They're not like big booze or entertainment places. They are what the traditional pub was. You know, it was a place that you socially interacted with your neighbour and your friends. So Prince and Pauper could come into the pub and stand there almost as equals if they had the price of the pint or a good story to tell.
So if somebody was going into one of these pubs in the 1920s, what would the experience have been like?
It would have been smelly. It would have been an all-male environment. So women didn't really come into pubs until really after the Second World War. I mean, I can remember my own mother not wanting to go into a public house because the bar was often very smelly. Men would be standing there having maybe worked a 12-hour shift, and they would stand at the bar and drink. The furnishings were very, very poor and bare, and they would stand at the bar having their drink, and they would spit on the floor, on a sawdust-ridden floor, and they would smoke pipe tobacco. So the environment for any sort of civilized human being wasn't great in the 1920s. But that didn't stop a lot of the would-be writers from 1930 to start to go into these certain pubs. There would be no female toilets, for example, in some of these pubs. So they were all male preserves, and there was one toilet, and that was for men.
Oh, wow. What kind of drinks would have been served back then?
Oh, whiskey and stout, the plain man's pint of porter. You know, the famous line, when things go wrong, it will not come right, though you do the best you can. When life looks blank as the hour of night, a pint of plain is your only man. So Guinness brought out this plain porter for the ordinary man, the ordinary sort of gossoon of Dublin, who would drink his plain man's porter. So the pint of Guinness was the drink of preference from the turn of the century. But that's very much on the wane now because of all the how the market has segmented itself, and there's all sorts of different beers and lagers and craft beers from the new craft breweries that have sprung up all over Ireland.
It's funny because for me as a tourist, so I've been to Ireland twice. I did this time I did like 2 weeks all over the island, and then last year I did 10 days just on the West Coast. And there is nothing to me that is more delicious in the world than a pint of Guinness in Ireland. Mm-hmm. But I feel like maybe if you were Irish, they might be the people looking for the variety.
Oh yeah, we would be looking for the variety in our drinks. I mean, I personally don't drink beer or stout. I used to drink Guinness years ago when I was a student, but I suppose your palate, you grow away from it, your palate changes, and I discovered that white wine and red wine were much more interesting. But I only drink red wine now because white wine is very. It's very heavy on the tummy, it can be quite gassy and difficult to digest. So red wine is not too much of it, but red wine is my preferred drink of choice. But for a lot of Irish people, the culture is still a beer culture, like it is in the UK. So our influences are, I suppose, to an extent the same as the influences over in England. But I mean, the market is changing. It's ever changing all the time. There are always new drinks being sold and marketed to Irish people, and by extension to the 6 or 7 million visitors who come to Ireland every year.
Yeah, Ireland is a very tourist-centric place, but I feel like you guys do a good job of keeping the tourists spread out across the island. So even though there are lots of tourists, it's not like they're all in one spot, even though maybe in Dublin it feels like they're all in Temple Bar.
Well, there are a few honeypots. Guinness's Brewery would be one of the biggest attraction in Ireland, and then the Great Book of Kells as well, which is fantastic visit. There'd be a huge sort of line of people waiting to go in to see that for their few minutes. And there's other fabulous places to go to in Dublin. I suppose Kilmainham Jail would be a great visit as well, and the Jameson Distillery and the Tullamore Dew experience. All these places they're all surrounded either in history or are sort of what we produce here in the south of Ireland, which is drinks of different kinds. So Ireland was a great producer and an exporter of whiskey up until the independence, and once we broke the connection with Britain, our whiskey selling and sales trailed behind the sale of Scotch in Scotland to a huge degree. I mean, we would only have something like about 5% of the world market compared to what Scotch has for the Scottish. So they benefited from the continuous connection with the empire and with Britain and with that whole distribution system, which we didn't when we cut ourselves off. Well, some would say cut our noses to spite our faces when we declared independence in 1922. But also Prohibition had a big impact as well in America, because a lot of our sales were to the United States, and once Prohibition happened, those distribution channels were automatically cut off.
I knew about the whiskey sales being down because I went on a whiskey tour in Dingle of one of the new whiskey facilities, but I had no idea that historically part of the reason for the decline was America's prohibition. You learn something about your own history all the time.
But then there's the disruption of our distribution system because we no longer were part of the British Empire. So once we cut ourselves off from that retarded our growth as a whiskey exporting nation. But it's changing again now. I mean, Jameson have love bombed all the bar staff of New York City to push their product, their different types of whiskies, and there's a lot of new distilleries opening up here in the city and in Ireland to get a portion of a segment of the market for themselves. So it's a much more colourful trade nowadays than it was.
So that's actually a great segue, because a lot of what you talk about happening, the important parts of Dublin and Irish history connected to these Dublin pubs, is some of the different writers, but also parts of the Irish independence movement. So do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that happened in some of the pubs that you cover that are related to Irish independence?
Well, certain pubs, one of the pubs that we'd go to is called the Old Stand, and we discovered that there was a great connection with one of the fathers of the Irish Free State, and a man called Michael Collins, who got information passed to him there about the workings of the British Secret Service. He was to carry on an assassination campaign against them for 2 years, which was known as the Irish War of Independence, and he went to London with full negotiating powers given to him by Eamon de Valera to sign the treaty, which created partition for Ireland, or cemented partition for Ireland. Now, De Valera was his boss, and De Valera was the president of Sinn Féin, stayed at home and accepted or rejected what was on offer. And what was on offer was the partition of Ireland. Collins went to London, signed that treaty, and came back to Dublin with it and handed it to the Irish Parliament. It was accepted by a very slim majority of Irish MPs, and those who said no to it took a section of the army that he founded, the old IRA, and so began the Irish Civil War. Now, pubs were places where a lot of information would be passed through to the members of the IRA, because often the curate in the pub was a fellow traveller. He was a member. He was on the inside, and he was perfectly positioned in a pub to spot an informer or a face that looked out of place, or somebody who wasn't really part of the local scene. So he knew his customers, he knew his members of the IRA, but he also knew who could be an informer, and he also had cellars downstairs where he could stash certain contraband that the British government didn't like, as in arms and ammunition. And usually people would go down and collect maybe some of those arms and go and do their damnedest for Irish freedom on that evening or that night time. So during 1919 to 1921, certain pubs in Dublin, I won't say all of them, but some of them played a key role in sort of the movement of information around from one person, one member of the movement to another.
So for American and Canadian listeners who may not be familiar with the Irish quest for independence, we know of events like the Easter Rebellion,
Bloody Sunday, but we don't know the full, we don't grow up with the full story. So can you give us like a quick overview of the events from, maybe the turn of the century through the era that we're talking about right now, just so people kind of know how these events connect to the things that they've heard before?
Well, that's a very big question and probably
yes, I know.
and a long drawn out one. But I suppose the turn of the century, you'd need to go back even a little bit further than that, 9 years before that, to the death of Parnell, Charles Stewart Parnell, who was the great political leader of Ireland. He ready to deliver home rule or domestic democracy for Ireland. But unfortunately, his career ended in the stench of the divorce courts in 1891 because he was involved with a married woman called Catherine O'Shea. Once he died, people turned away from sort of straightforward parliamentary politics and constitutional politics in disgust about the way in which Ireland had let down Parnell. He was pulled apart by a pack of hounds, as the writer W.B. Yeats said, and that the British government also had a role in bringing him down because they felt he was too powerful. He held the balance of power in the House of Commons in Britain between two big political blocs, the Conservatives on the one side and the Liberals on the other. Don't forget, at this stage, we were still being governed from the mother of parliaments in London. Ireland didn't have its own domestic parliament. It did up until 1800, but that was closed down for about 120 years. So we were governed by the House of Commons, and that meant there was a great movement in the 19th century to have independence in many forms, both political, economic, and also spiritual independence, in the sense that we needed a return for Catholic emancipation, that Catholics themselves, the vast majority of the country, could practice their religion freely, and to also be allowed entry into jobs like the civil service and the army, and that they could play a proper role in Irish life. So there was a whole movement towards enfranchising the Irish people right throughout the 19th century. That stopped suddenly with Parnell's death. And as a result of that, the new paramilitary movements like the Irish Republican Brotherhood and other organisations like the Irish Volunteers, they came to the fore then and started to march and protest and whip up interest in their way of taking Irish history forward, which was violently. So the pacifist movement was dead and buried for quite some time, and the men of arms, people like Patrick Pearse, we did the clear, clean, sheer thing, Pearse said, in 1916, and other people played a huge role in bringing forward to 1916, where that rebellion erupted on the streets of Dublin at Easter 1916. And that really was the beginning of the end of British role in Irish domestic affairs from 1916 to 1922. But right from 1891 to 1916, there was a lot of things politically bubbling up under the surface, which eventually burst out in that campaign in 1916.
Well, I asked you a huge question, and you did a really good job of making it really simple. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I've just taken the headlines, yeah.
So your work doesn't just center around the politics of these pubs and how they played a role politically, although that is one of your focuses, but you also focus on the literature that comes out of these pubs. And I think that some of Ireland's most famous authors, the ones that most Americans, if they have gone into any kind of real literary education, will have read and learned about. But who are some of the authors that we're talking about?
Well, the authors we talk about are, first and foremost, James Joyce, who was one of Ireland's greatest literary export, and that he got out of the country and said goodbye to the famous 4 F words of Irish life: faith, fatherland, family and friendship. He would have spent a lot of time in the pubs in and around Dublin in his earlier years. He did leave Ireland at the age of 22 finally, but he was often in various pubs, but set some of his episodes of Ulysses in various pubs in the city, namely Davy Byrne's won the Lestrygonians chapter of the novel is set there, and also another famous section which marries politics and and history and literature is set in Barney Kiernan's pub, where the citizen speaks to the central character Leopold Bloom about whether he's a real Irish person and how could he be if he's a Jew. So Leopold Bloom, this everyman Jew who lived in Dublin in 1904, does a very good job of fighting back verbally against this anti-Semite character, who is based on a real-life character, a man called Michael Cusack, who founded the GAA, or the Gaelic Athletic Association, which is a very prominent organisation for sport and for political influence in Ireland. But what was your question again?
So James Joyce, what is another author?
Joyce, yeah. And then Samuel Beckett was another of the great writers that we talk about. But Beckett himself was, not particularly enamoured of the Dublin pub scene. He said it was full of paralysis, indiscretion and broken glass. And he was to leave Ireland in 1938 and return home to Paris, as he said. France at war is better than Ireland at peace. So Beckett wasn't really, he had a love-hate relationship with Dublin and with the pub scene, because he felt that it was so stultifying, and it was paralysing, as he said himself. So it was full of failure. That Dublin was a place of failure and rancour. That many of the writers identified. They identified what it was, but they didn't want to identify with it. So that's why some of them got out as quickly as they could. Beckett was another one. And then, of course, the great Flann O'Brien, who was a very much a pub writer. One of the early sections of At Swim Two Birds is set inside Grogan's pub, where one character introduces the other to the first pint of stout that he has. Flann O'Brien is a fantastically satirical writer who wrote At Swim Two Birds in 1939. And it was widely praised as one of the great satirical novels of the 20th century. He was strongly associated with one pub, and that's called the Palace. In fact, two strongly associated, because he died of alcoholism at the age of, I think, 66 in 1966.
Oh, wow. And then you also talk a lot about Oscar Wilde, who is probably the author that you cover that Americans are most familiar with. And I think most Americans have read Oscar Wilde at some point.
Sure. We do talk about Oscar Wilde, but not in relation to pubs. We do so in relation to Trinity College and the Georgian city that they left behind, that the Anglo-Irish left behind, that Dublin is so famous for. So Marion Square, Fitzwilliam Square, and also Parnell Square on the north side, and Stephen's Green. They're all Georgian squares, but Oscar himself lived in number 1 Marion Square because his father was a well-to-do physician, and he was appointed, or he was made a Sir. He was knighted by Queen Victoria for his work. And just around the corner from number 1 Marion Square is a great pub called Kennedy's. And then right behind it, you've got the whole expanse of Trinity College that Oscar went to at the age of 17. So we do talk about Oscar. We talk about him in America when he goes off in his famous lecture circuit of the United States. Was asked to play, or asked to speak about his famous subjects, art and aesthetics, all over America. Even the people of Griggsville in Illinois sent him a telegram. I think the mayor of Griggsville sent him a telegram to say, will you come to Griggsville and talk to us about art and aesthetics? And he said, yes, of course I will, but be sure to change the name of your town before I do so. So Oscar was he was very flippant and put down everybody as he went along. But of course they all adored it. They all adored him. I have nothing to declare except my genius when he arrived in America. And he was asked about the Atlantic, and he said it was underrated. And then when he came home to Portsmouth afterwards, he said about what he thought about the Atlantic, and he said I think he said something like it had a lot to offer. In the sense that it was a turbulent crossing for him. But Oscar is probably one of the easiest and most accessible writers for all our customers, because our customers on the Literary Pub Crawl are from all over the world, not just Americans. We've got, incredibly, last night there was no American on the tour.
Oh, wow.
There was people from Malta, from Germany, from Belgium, 4 people from Dublin, and there was people from Poland on the tour. And that was it. We had about 15 or 16 people, because it was obviously a very cold February evening last night. But if you think in the summertime, you wouldn't even see that type of sweep of an audience. You'd find many of the audience would indeed be Americans or Canadians or people from the Western Hemisphere, shall we say?
Yeah, I think it's growing up. Ireland is a country that it seems like every American I know has an affinity for. Like they may feel like some might want to see Germany, some might want to see France, some might want to see England, but it seems like everybody wants to go to Ireland. So you
Hmm.
do run into a lot of American and Canadian tourists when you're there. Also, because you're an English speaking country, it makes it very accessible to Americans who may have a fear of traveling places where they don't speak the language because
Yeah.
it's a lot of times I think our Americans' first trips will be to a English speaking country and then they get comfortable and branch out.
Mm. Well, also we've got that sort of way about us in Ireland that we were quite happy and welcoming to the visitor, and we help them along. You'd often find that if your visitor standing in the street corner and one is holding a map and they don't know where they're going, is that usually a large person will approach and say where to, and because the famous joke is where are you going to? They'd say, well, we're going to Guinness's Brewery, and the person would say, well, you wouldn't start from here. So this is often the way this is often the way we begin a conversation with the visitor. I know it's a tired old joke or a hackneyed old joke, but it's often great fun to intervene where the tourists are going in the wrong direction and put them on the right road. So it's we have that kind of direct approach with the visitor, which is we haven't lost. And if we were to lose that, things would be very poor. That we become like any other country where we don't welcome in the visitor. We have what's known as the Céad Míle Fáilte, or the 1,000 welcomes.
So, what do you think that Samuel Beckett or James Joyce would think of Dublin today?
I don't know. They probably would find it very bourgeois. But they decried the fact that it was poor and it was a place of failure and rancor when they were here in the early 20th century. What would they think about it now? Goodness knows. They thought. Particularly Beckett was a very separate artist. He worked very, very much inside his own head, in the sense that he was so interested in language. I don't know what he'd make of the language of the street nowadays, with the preponderance of the word "like" in every second sentence. Whether he'd enjoy Dublin. He was very separate, very private. He liked the countryside. He loved South County Dublin, to walk in the hills and the mountains and so on. I'm not too sure. I've never met him personally. You probably need to ask someone else who has met him about what he would think of Dublin. But I would see him as a person, because he lived in Paris for so long and had a very quiet, sort of almost spiritual life. He was like a scholar and a priest of literature when he lived over in Paris, and he enjoyed meeting people. But still, though, he still spent his 8 hours or 10 hours a day, in front of his typewriter, working at his craft. So it's hard to answer a question like that. I think Joyce would be probably more interested, more embracing of the Dublin of today, because he put everything into his work. He was always out on the street listening to language, how it's being used, how it changed. The songs, the stories, the anecdotes of Dublin were in all his works. Whereas Beckett always said that while Joyce put everything into his work and marshalled the facts, Beckett himself kept everything out as far as possible. That English would give me too many opportunities for the stylist. In French, you can write without style. So he started to write in the French language, which allowed him to create this pared down, minimalist style of language, which actors particularly love to perform, because there's not a phrase or a syllable sort of wasted in the work of Samuel Beckett.
If you were going to suggest to a listener to pick up one work by Joyce or Beckett or any of the authors that you cover that would help them understand the city the most, what would you suggest?
Well, yeah, I suppose if for an advanced student of Irish literature, Joyce's Ulysses is the one to pick up. But there are so many allusions and references to Irish lore and Irish history that it might be difficult for a visitor to cop onto it or to jump on board. But one of the ways that I always tell people to go through Ulysses is to take the book, open it, and then go online and type in Ulysses recordings, and you go to a great section which the RTE Players, the Irish BBC drama department, have recorded the whole book, and you can listen to it with street sounds in the background and read along with the writers or with the actors. Another great way to do it is to go to Sweeney's Chemist and Bookshop, which is just on Lincoln Place, and they do readings on a regular basis all week of Joyce's work. Samuel Beckett's probably different. I'd say some of his plays are the best. Crap's Last Tape is a fantastic one to read, to see on stage, because I always believe that see it better and hear it spoken well by an actor is the one to do. Another one would be obviously Waiting for Godot, which is his first big one, which was produced first in France in 1952 or 53, I think it was. And then Happy Days would be another excellent play by Beckett to listen to. They won't tell you much about Dublin, but they will tell you a huge amount about the language of Dublin, the accent of Dublin, and the repartee, and the wit, and the nuance of the language that is used on the Dublin tongue.
Now, how did you get started down this path as your career? How did you end up founding the Dublin Literary Pub Crawl?
Well, I studied history in university, and I also studied some English while I was doing a diploma in teaching. So I did a small amount of teaching, but I was basically laughed out of the classroom by youngsters who, when I wasn't able to do it at that time, when I was very young. But I'd love to come back to it now. But I then got involved in the theatre with a group of people down in Cork City in the south when I was studying. And I came back to Dublin because that's where I'm from, and I got connected with some of the theatre companies. So I bobbed along that way until 1988 when we came up with the Literary Pub Crawl, because an academic was taking people around from point to point on the bars, and myself and another actor joined him, and we set off a couple of the performances from the writers, and that kind of was the gel of the idea. So I kept it going from then on, and it's developed very, very well over the years. I suppose about nearly 750,000 people have joined the Literary Pub Crawl over the years, and it's now in its 30th year this year, 2018.
Amazing! Congratulations!
Thank you.
I was there in October, so it was still 2017. I don't know if you mentioned that you guys were turning 30. So congratulations!
Thank you.
So if somebody was coming to Dublin, obviously they should do the Literary Pub Crawl, and So like I said, I was on a sponsored tour where the Fáilte Ireland, the Irish Tourism Board, had put together an itinerary for a group of us that was like Irish literature and culture. So I didn't know before I got to the Literary Pub Crawl what was going to happen. So I was just, I was just along for the ride. And then it completely blew me away. People should definitely go if they're going to Dublin. But do you want to explain a little bit about what it is? Because a literary pub crawl maybe doesn't, I don't know if people understand exactly what.
Oh, sure. I mean, we spend thousands of pounds every year trying to explain to people before they come along what it is, but sure, they never know until, I suppose it has a good reputation in some ways, and then that's why people land at our doorstep waving their money looking to come along. But once they enter the door and they sit down in the first room when they have to have their pint in front of them, the light goes on, the stage light goes on, and it's taken over by actors. And when you have an actor, talking on stage and lifting the work off the page of the writer, then it becomes a totally different thing. It's almost like a sort of a moving performance from one point to the next. I don't know if you got that impression from it, but
oh, absolutely.
I like to think that's what it is. So we move from bar to bar, but along the way we slot in all the different performances and the biographical detail about different writers and where they're connected to in Trinity or in certain pubs around Dublin, and then the actors burst into some of the language of the writer to give an introductory feel as to what the style is and what they're on about, whether it's politically or socially, if it's got any connections with the area or with the building or with the city itself. So humor it's driven by humor as well. It's fun, it's entertaining, and we like to kind of drop in some of the serious stuff as well, but in the midst of the humour as well, while people are laughing. And there's also the famous quiz as well, sponsored by Tullamore Dew, and there's whiskies to win and also T-shirts to win as well. So it's kind of a package of entertainment for a night of about 2.5 hours.
It's like you're going on a pub crawl, but you're also at Shakespeare in the Park. Except with different authors. But for somebody like me, or I'm sure somebody listening to this show, you really couldn't ask for more than that. That is a perfect night.
It's educational and fun. It's obviously not for everybody. It has its niche in the market, but it was the original. It's the world original. It's been copied by lots of people all around the world, in London and in Edinburgh. It's been copied in America, twice in New York, 2 different types of tours. in New York. But I suppose the original is Dublin because it's got a very good reason why you'd have a tour like that in Dublin, because the city is small and the pubs are all sort of gathered around very close to each other. And then the writers visited one or the other. They had their own band of friends in one particular pub, and some cliques didn't mix particularly well. And also there was a movement from one pub to the other to make sure that you made the connections with the right editor of the right newspaper. So newspapers were the important thing, especially after 1930, that drove a lot of writers to come into the pubs. Because before that, you didn't really have mass circulation newspapers as such. The Irish Press newspaper was the big one that brought on a lot of younger writers and made sure that they weren't living penniless and starving, because they paid them for their work.
If someone is going to come to Dublin and they want to make sure to go on your pub crawl, how can they find you?
Well, they find us at the Duke Pub, which is number 9 Duke Street, and they can do so every night of the week, right through from April to at the end of October every year. And also in the wintertime, Thursday, Friday, Saturdays and Sundays in the same location. So the Duke is our home. It's our starting point. It's a great old traditional Dublin pub on Duke Street, just off Grafton Street. But also a lot of people are booking online beforehand now just to secure a spot to make sure that they get in on the tour, because it can be very busy in the summertime. So the best way to do that is just go online, dublinpubcrawl.com, and buy your tickets, and it's all done and set. So you show up then with your booking reference and you get your ticket and get a pint at the bar and sit into the room and start listing out.
Well, Colm, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for just having such a great show. It actually inspired me. I was in Tunisia in December and was in a bookstore, and they had a copy of Ulysses for sale. And so I am very, very slowly reading my way through Ulysses, inspired by going to your show. So thank you for the inspiration, but then also thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you again to Colm for coming on the show. If you're ever in Dublin, I highly recommend going to his pub crawl. And if you aren't, take his advice and crack open Ulysses and read along to one of the performances he suggested. As a very, very recent James Joyce convert, I'd welcome some company along the journey. If you do end up reading Ulysses, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Send me an email to stephanie@historyfangirl.com and tell me what you think. Housekeeping. I'm back in Sofia. So I'm working on recording a bunch of episodes for the next few months. I've got amazing guests lined up on some really cool places. And then I'm also working on a second podcast, which is more of a humorous show, and it's more strictly about travel. And that show will be co-hosted with Chris Mitchell from travelingmitch.com. He has been on this show. He was the guest when we talked about Istanbul's Grand Bazaar. He's one of my good friends, and I'm really excited to be launching this second travel podcast. And when it's ready, I'll tell you guys all about it. In the meantime, if you could take a moment to rate and review the show on the podcast app of your choice, that would be just lovely. And thank you so much for listening.